Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. I'm your host today, Jen Gerson, and today I had on Flavio Volpe. He is a Canadian automotive industry leader, member of the Order of Canada, and president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Why is he here on? Because he's been spicy on Twitter lately, talking about U.S.-Canada trade and the coming renegotiation of Kumska-Umska-Kumukuskuma. It's a very enjoyable conversation, so stick with me on the line.
This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Dominion Dynamics. Canada has never had true sovereign awareness of our north. Vast parts of our country are a blind spot. And when you can't see your own territory, you can't defend it, secure it, or respond when threats emerge. Dominion Dynamics is changing that. Dominion is building a sovereign command and control capability that lets Canada and its allies see, respond, and defend across every domain. We started in the Arctic, where extreme conditions demand technology no one else can deliver. Threats don't wait for bureaucracy. They are moving faster than our institutions. Dominion is closing that gap. Speed is now the strategic capability, and Dominion Dynamics is proving you can build capability at the speed of the threat. Defend the Dominion. Dominion Dynamics. Learn more at defendthedominion.com.
With us on the line, Mr. Volpe, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jen.
All right, so I'm just going to dig right into it because the U.S.-Canada trade file we know is huge and also highly confusing. Last week, I believe we had a whole bunch of articles come out, particularly around Politico, effectively saying that the Canadians have totally botched the U.S.-Canada trade relationship. And I wanted to talk to you because you have been on Twitter and you have been spicy about this. So from your perspective, what do you think is happening on the U.S.-Canada file, and why do you think it's possible that maybe the Canadians aren't screwing this up for once?
Look, I think that the political reporting was wrong. What it said was that the sectoral negotiations that were happening in the fall, where Canada-U.S. looked like they were going to come back from the cliff on steel and aluminum, not automotive, fell apart over a reason different than what's been reported. What's reported is that the president was upset with Doug Ford's ads with Ronald Reagan's voice. That's it. That's the story. That's the kind of tumultuous relationship that anybody who's dealing with Donald Trump has. Well, the political reporting was somehow when Stellantis and General Motors decided to idle a couple of plants, and the Canadian government that was giving remissions, relief to all the companies that make cars here, say, look, if you're not going to make cars here, you're going to lose that relief. And you've made covenants to the government and will pursue you on those. Well, the political story 4 months later said that's what broke the talks up. Well, nobody who's around the talks ever heard that. Nobody was in the meetings ever heard that. The idea that, the story said that Detroit was so upset by Canada that it went to the White House and asked them to stop the talks, and that's what happened. The idea that the car companies were getting pounded with 50% extra costs on steel and aluminum, the two main ingredients in making cars, would say, please don't give us that relief because we're offended that some of the relief that Canada is giving against the punishment you're giving is being reduced. It's absurd. I said that to the reporter repeatedly on the record, and she chose not to run it, but didn't make the reality of the story any different. And 2 days later, the entire industry in the U.S., car makers, parts makers, dealers, co-authored a letter to the White House to say, please, we need USMCA to survive. Canada and Mexico are important. So here's Reuters 2 days later saying the exact opposite. And I think it's an important picture on how these negotiations are happening. They're quieter now than they were in 2017, 18, and 19. And Jen, you and I got to know each other with just how public some of us were talking about what was happening. They're very discreet. You've got to really understand the dynamics of Trump 2.0, which is things can turn on a dime. But also math matters. And so if you're going to push a position, that math has to be accretive to the Americans if you're really going to push it. And usually, we're so integrated, those positions are accretive to Canada as well.
So here's the other thing that I found interesting about a lot of that reporting, and then I want to get into the big picture about what we think is
Sure.
happening on the trade file. Acknowledging that neither of us are in the room either, we're just trying to understand the tea leaves from where we are. But even if it, let's say, presumably, guess there were some really great early talks between Carney and Trump, things seem to be heading in a positive direction. 2 weeks later, you've got this Ronald Reagan ad, which totally inflames Trump. And you have this Melanie Jolie going to Stellantis saying, your money will be withdrawn. I think she said money would be withdrawn, or she was going to sue them for relief for the money that they had already given them. Which one was it?
It's both. It's just complicated.
Both.
One is,
Okay.
hey, you made commitments to us and we flowed you money. So you have to stick to your commitments or we'll pull the money back.
And I do remember at the time, there was some contemporaneous coverage about this saying her decision to do this was going to add tension to this file. So there was some coverage to that effect. But those two things alone really don't strike me as being large enough irritants to have single-handedly scuttled a major trade relationship in more normal times. Right?
That's right.
Like those things would have been considered irritants, or maybe some things you would talk about at the table. But in and of themselves, if Canada is no longer allowed to advocate for its own interests in America, then our relationship with America is a subservient one, fundamentally.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the perspective people have to take is we are dependent on the U.S. market, but we've never been subservient to American interests. We have worked rather well together to build a joint economy. Sure, total sovereignty, two different currencies. But we at least in the post World War II era, seen the world very similarly, and our consumers behave in very similar ways. We also, one of the things that we also did that the Americans were religious on is non-intervention in the free market. And Donald Trump, who is the first billionaire president, came to power to some degree by saying, hey, by the way, the free market and private industry has got the best solutions. The government should get out of the way. But he's behaved as the most interventionist president in the history of at least post-industrial USA. And these are the things that we used to say are real big problems with dealing with China: centrally planned economy, industrial policy leading the way, picking and supporting disruptive companies to poke holes in the free market. Well, the U.S. is not acting like a free market. And in fairness to Donald Trump, that started to some degree with Biden's Inflation Recovery Act and his Build Back Better Act. But Donald Trump's taken it to another level because at least Biden said he was being interventionist. Donald Trump continues to say free market, free market, free market. While he toys with the market every single day. We need to understand that we can't actually toy with the market. We don't have a large enough platform. We do not have the leverage. We're not, in spite of the fact that, yes, we should as middle powers find other middle powers. We haven't created some super Avengers union here that can fight back against the evil empire. We are now looking at the two world's biggest superpowers. They're both a little spicy with us and really don't care about free market principles. And that changed the way we hit the negotiating table.
So let's talk about that. From your industry's perspective right now, what is the state of the existing negotiations? We know we're dealing with the July 1st deadline of some kind. We don't know what the Americans are going to do after that. What are you hearing from industry right now?
Yeah, so really importantly, industry on both sides of the border, and actually in Mexico as well, are all saying the same thing. The USMCA is very important. The free market access between the three countries, so that this whole region, led by the Americans, this whole region can compete with the rest of the world. The rest of the world really means China. Everybody else is on their heels because of the Chinese rise. They've put it in writing. They've like this letter that was reported on in the Reuters reporting last week. They've said in writing to the administration at the USTR USMCA hearings in December, where we were the only Canadian out of 149 speakers, the only Canadian industry who USTR sought official submissions on. We said the same thing that our American counterparts said was, if the U.S. is going to be competitive, it needs access to things in Canada and Mexico, and in return, we would also line up our industrial interests and our industrial policy with the U.S. For example, when you say you don't need Canadian cars, you're talking about American car companies, Ford, General Motors, Stellantis. And yes, everybody talks about the Japanese are making 3/4 of the cars in Canada. Well, that's only because this is no disrespect to Toyota and Honda, who are amazing, but they didn't increase their production. Trump has been very successful in idling a whole bunch of capacity with American companies. He's pounding American companies who repatriate their profits to Detroit and Dearborn and Auburn Hills. Canada is the biggest export market for American auto parts. So $29 billion in auto parts come over the border every year. They go into Hondas and Toyotas and into Ford's, GM's, Chrysler, Dodge. And we buy American steel and we buy American tools. And so the industry has lined up across the continent and said, you're actively hurting primarily American interests. And we have been supporting and partnering American interests because they're also our interests. And please stop.
So this is something that I think is really important for people to understand who are maybe looking at this who don't have your expertise. There is no such thing as a Canadian car or an American car or a Japanese car in this context because we're such an integrated market. So it's steel goes down, auto part gets made, auto part gets moved back up, auto part gets then put into a car then gets sold to another one of these markets. Like these are casseroles. They're not
That's right.
right. Okay. So what has been the impact of the trade war to date on Canadian car parts manufacturers and car manufacturers?
Look, last year around this time, we've got the only quiet victory that we've had since Trump said, "I'm going to tariff everything." In automotive, there's two main parts. There's two main product categories: the cars that are assembled, that go in either direction, or like you talked about, that matrix of parts. In Canada, there's about $35 billion worth of annual production capacity in parts, and about 50% goes directly into the U.S. to go into U.S. assembly, and the other half goes into Canadian assembly. The half that goes into Canadian assembled cars everywhere from Windsor to Oshawa is down about 30 to 35% year over year, because there's a 25% tariff on the cars that are made there. They are ostensibly destined to the U.S., and Americans are buying less cars that are 25% more expensive. On the auto parts side, we all advocated, much like you talked about, Jen, that that a component could cross the border 7 times before it ends up in a customer's hands as a car. And every time it goes back and forth, if you tariffed that, what we calculated for American importers is a $75 million tariff bill a day. So what we started saying last March and April is, if you do that, you're going to shut the industry down in a week. 75, 150, 225, 300, 375. That's week one. Who's paying for it? And we managed to advocate as an industry together. We started here in Canada saying that, and then the Americans, the same ones that co-signed that letter that we talked about last week, wrote, the same American groups wrote to the same American officials, said, you're going to shut the industry down. And they very quietly gave an update through Customs and Border Patrol on a Thursday afternoon and said, okay, no tariff on parts. Well, that's kept the industry open, but hurting. You can't be in a business where you have a 6 or 7% profit margin and then be down 30% in revenue, and that half of your customers can't sell their products or they're subsidizing the sales. And so I know I sound calm, but we need urgent relief in automotive. And if we don't solve this through the USMCA renewal over the next several months, then you're going to see a lot of these companies decide, okay, am I really going to burn $2 billion a year? Or am I going to start to wind down? It doesn't mean, like, we had this Honda news where they canceled the biggest announced EV investment in their history, which was a $15 billion announcement for Ontario. They've now officially indefinitely postponed it. What doesn't mean it's going to Ohio,
Hmm.
and it doesn't mean that it's going to be built in Japan. The White House has effectively burned that commercial opportunity for that company for everybody.
Right. Firstly, you don't sound calm. You sound Canadian enraged, and I can tell the difference. So I'm not sure the Americans always can, but I hear it. I hear it. Right now, what's the concern that we're looking for? Is the auto industry looking to that July 1st deadline to find out what happens, or is there another deadline that they're looking for, or another economic indicator that they're looking for that will allow them to decide whether or not to continue fighting things out or start winding plants down?
Well, I think we all know nothing's going to happen by July the 1st, but we
Right.
know that on June 1st, Ambassador Greer, who is the U.S. Trade representative, and for your listeners, the equivalent of Trump's Minister of Trade, is going to go to Congress, and he's going to signal to Congress officially what they intend to do. Do they intend to pull out of the USMCA, which I don't think anybody expects that. Are they going to raise a series of issues that they're informing Congress that they're going to push Canada and Mexico for? Are those issues symmetrical? Are they going to try to pursue two bilateral scabs on the trilateral agreement? What's really important is that trade is the responsibility of Congress, not
Mm.
the executive branch. Doesn't mean that they can't affect it. We've all seen this. But if they make major changes to the USMCA, they have to reopen the enabling legislation that has to go to Congress.
Mm.
So they don't have a lot of wiggle room there either. We think that they're going to seek improvements to the American position in the automotive rules,
Mhm.
i.e., how can they drive more business to the US? Well, in 2019, when we went from NAFTA to USMCA, the new rules of origin resulted in American content in Canadian cars going from 38% to 50% in 2024.
So that's a
That
big
is,
win for
that's a big,
America.
that's a big win, and part of the reason why I think we successfully advocated for a parts exemption. Hey, by the way, you're winning.
Mhm.
Um, while you're winning, don't call the game. You haven't played enough innings here
Mhm.
to make it official.
Mhm.
Um, uh, they wanted to keep more Chinese goods out of vehicles, the component list. They want to keep Chinese materials out. And so there are ways to improve that. Uh, right now, 70% of the steel that's in core parts has to come from North American sources. Well, it's not melted and poured. Maybe that's where the discussion is going to go. Maybe that number they'll ask for is 80. Anyway, the point is all of that negotiation is going to happen, I think, over the summer. I think there's a real prospect here that we have a deal into the fall. Um, it would likely be useful for the president at his midterms in the first week of November. So if we have the makings of a deal by Labor Day or so, you'll start to see calculations in Washington on when's best for them to use it. The districts that they have to defend in these midterm elections in Congress are manufacturing districts. And if
Mhm.
you can say to people in Michigan, hey, by the way, we've confirmed a quantitative gain in the automotive rules, uh, you can make them happy.
So what
Um,
what what happens hypothetically? And I'm going to the dark place because I'm a
sure.
journalist and I can't help it. But what happens hypothetically? July 1st comes around. Trump pitches a fit, just says, "Screw it, Kuzma, Makuzkama, Uzkmaka is now over. We're pulling out." Like what does that doomsday scenario look like for you?
Um, well, if he says nothing, it just continues.
Mhm.
He has to trigger a pullout, which he's
Mhm.
threatened in the NAFTA negotiations. There's a 6-month clause you can trigger that. He might. Um, we think that's a negotiating. I mean, I think that would be just very hard negotiating. What it means is if they pulled out and there was tariffs on everything, that would probably mean the end of General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. They are
In
heavily
Canada
exposed
or in United States?
as companies. They
Oh,
are these are companies that are heavily invested in component manufacturing and assembly in all three countries, and it makes them extremely competitive. These are Yes, we hear about the Chinese every day, but these are 120-year-old companies that have survived the worst. And, the best-selling car in the US is not a Chinese car. It's not a hatchback.
Ford
It's a
F-150.
made from Quebec aluminum, and 950,000 of them a year. And so if you cut off Ford from its production in Canada, if you cut off its component sourcing from Canada and Mexico, you're really, really going to hurt it. General Motors makes trucks. Its best-selling line is trucks, 750,000 of those a year. They make them here. They make them in the U.S. and they make them in Mexico. And same with Ram as part of Stellantis. Uh, eh, um, if the president decides ultimately that he wants to kill the USMCA, in the business that I'm in, the biggest losers will be American companies. Never mind, we have a major problem here. But he would be putting 120-year-old brands that are synonymous with American excellence at risk of closing their doors.
So what happens if he goes to those brands and says, "I'll give you a multi-billion-dollar bailout. You have to use that money to reshore all of your parts manufacturing in America, and we're pulling out of Canada." What happens in that scenario? Is that a viable?
It's not viable because those companies don't own their part suppliers. First of all, 75% of the components that go into vehicles come from separate companies, and some of those companies are very, very important Canadian and Mexican companies that make engines and engine blocks for those trucks,
Well,
especially in
let's
those
say
SUVs.
you use your bailout money, you buy those companies, and you reshore them. I mean, I'm
Well,
talking
those
multi-billion-dollar bailout kind of here.
Yeah, it's not that simple. You can't just go out and buy those companies. I mean, those companies have to agree to sell, and those
Right.
companies are um, globally relevant. Like a Magna, which is one of the world's biggest auto suppliers, maybe top three Canadian company. It's got 330 plants around the world. It would be very hurt. Linamar, 65, Guelph-based 65 plants around the world, be very hurt by the fall of a USMCA, but could survive, ultimately survive the storm. Isn't going to just take an offer and lie down. These are resilient companies that are now global. They're Canadian companies, companies like Nemak out of Mexico that do engine blocks and major castings for the American companies. They'd find a way. The other thing is that um, um, you could do something like what you talked about if you're in a service business or you're in the automotive software business.
Hmm.
But when you make things, um, uh, uh, there's massive capital expenses, but also really long timelines. So you could say, well, move this stuff. Well, move this stuff means 3 to 5 years. We've gone
Hmm.
a year with incredibly punitive tariffs. Nobody's moved. Some
Hmm.
companies have crumbled, but nobody's moved.
Hmm.
Because while I'm punishing you and costing you money, and I'm also taking away consumer incentives, and I'm really hurting consumer confidence and economic certainty, you're not going to move whatever capital you have into some speculative new production because you don't know what my next move will be.
Right.
And so it's beyond Donald Trump's announcement that $13 trillion of investments come into the US. I would defy anybody who listens to this. Tell me where the first new auto plant is. Just
Right.
tell me, and I'll come back on the show and apologize.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by Electro Federation Canada. Canada's clean electricity grid gives us a competitive edge in attracting global investment. But to maintain that advantage, our system needs to break down barriers and unlock the grid. Aging infrastructure, supply chain constraints, and outdated regulations threaten our ability to expand and modernize the grid, essential components of meeting future capacity needs. Electro Federation Canada has developed a research-backed roadmap for grid readiness, focused on smart policy and regulatory alignment. To learn more, visit maketheswitch.electrofed.com.
Okay, so here's where we get into the human element, which I think is sometimes the most fascinating element of all of this. And I have to ask you this. Whenever there's a complicated trade deal, both parties are going to have disagreements, irritants, areas that they'd like to improve. That's dead normal stuff.
Yeah.
Trade deals are insanely complicated. Um, but if we weren't dealing with a Donald Trump presidency, if we were dealing with a more ordinary American president, a Mitch, you know, thinking off the top of my head, a Joe Biden presidency, Obama presidency. Let's even go really radical and say, a Gavin Newsom presidency. So it's like, even weird American president, but not Donald
Yes.
Trump level weird. Would any of this be headline news, or would these trade disagreements be the sort of thing that longtime partners would just be hashing out behind the scenes, and people like me would be ignoring them because they'd be minor? Are these minor irritants is what I'm asking.
They could even be major irritants, but as long as they're within the structure of the way that two states work with each other, then you can work on it. And we'll use Joe Biden for the moment. He in 2021, post-pandemic, put this omnibus bill out there, Build Back Better. And in it, he said, I'm going to give $7,500 to $12,500 to American consumers to buy made in America vehicles. Electrified vehicles is what it was. And we said here, I mean, that's the killer. Why would you put an American filter on a subsidy that would otherwise be deemed to be against the spirit of the USMCA that would hurt your major trading partners? Well, we did a really big diplomatic and advocacy offensive, both countries, Canada and Mexico. And as industries we mobilized, we said at the time, and it was very true for the time, that's the most protectionist American industrial policy in our automotive history. We managed to get him to put the word North in that made in America, made in North America. Then he switched to the Inflation Reduction Act. He took all that money, put it in a new act and said, okay, fine. You'll get the North America part, but we're going to pay for the batteries. So anybody who wants to make batteries in the US, here's a standing credit, essentially pay for the whole thing. Well, anything we wanted to do here in electrification was killed by that. We spent a lot of time and a lot of money. Jen, you and I talked over the years about how much money was going to go into making batteries in Windsor and St. Thomas as a reaction to what the Americans were doing. All of that was major, major, major news, but we didn't talk about it every day because countries know how to talk to each other, how to negotiate with each other, and respect the agreements between each other. The difference on the Trump administration, at least in 2.0, is they did an inventory of all the emergency powers that the president can use in trade so that he can bypass Congress. And then he can just announce on day one, hey, by the way, I'm going to punish you because I want to. It's very hard to deal with that because Congress isn't even pulling him back.
So there is something that is fundamentally, it's not that the Canada-U.S. relationship on trade and auto has always been seamless or without problems. There's always been problems. But something has fundamentally changed on the human level and how we're dealing with the Americans here that makes them, from our perspective, untrustworthy and unreliable.
Yes, and I think that from the American perspective, the at least from this administration's perspective, is saying who sets the rules, where the rules come from, who decides what goodwill and shared values are. We are the biggest market in the world. Between Canada and the U.S., we are 9 times or 10 times bigger, maybe 11 times bigger in terms of GDP. So we'll tell you what the rules are, and the rules are the president doesn't like the old rules, and we'll tell you we don't like your prime minister. This was Justin Trudeau.
They don't like the new one either, I don't think.
No. But I'll tell you what happened with the old one was. Look, we don't like you, and we're not going to worry about what the USMCA says between us. We don't like you. I got emergency powers. I'm going to use them. I don't care what Congress thinks, and it makes it very difficult for Canada to wiggle its way out of that. And so the president of the United States and his executive like to say, well, the only two countries that retaliated are Canada and China. Well, China because it can, and Canada because it had to. Now, we reset that relationship. They certainly don't like that Mark Carney has got some global public equity, political equity. Um, but the two leaders talk a lot, um, and off they it hasn't resulted in Donald Trump retreating from positions where he uses tariffs improperly or illegally. But that is also, a lot of people like say, well, Mark Carney, where are you? I thought we were going to have a deal by last July. Well, the fact of the matter is, you can't pull the American president to the table. You can try and strategize and try to find some leverage and or make some offers. Like we took the digital services tax off.
Mhm.
What did we get out of that, Jen? The Blue Jays lost the World Series. I mean, I didn't see any benefit that came out of that.
We also
Um,
lost the world hockey thing, the hockey ball. You know
yes,
what I'm saying? The
yes,
big hockey
yes,
game.
yes.
That one.
Yeah, the Olympic gold. I mean, there. If the president doesn't agree that the USMCA is the governing document between the two countries, and might is right, you're in a tough place. I do think that
So
the government.
just to put a pin in that point,
Sure.
from our perspective, it seems like this is way less about trade and way more about dominance. Is that fair to
Yes,
say? Okay.
I mean, I think any casual observer there would, if someone would argue on that point for you, I would give them 10 minutes to see them do gymnastics. This is about dominance. Everything this administration does is about dominance. I do think one of the strategic differences between today and um, uh, uh, Trump 1.0 is that this government has instituted a discipline of not negotiating out loud. Look, if you got a guy who doesn't care about the rules and he cares about leverage, he's not going to care about the law. He's going to care about leverage. Um, don't moralize. Don't preach. Uh, um, do your work. Speak to him. Don't talk about the times that you've spoken to him, and don't tell tales out of school. I think we've been rather disciplined. The analyst industry, of which I spend some time in, is doing a lot of like, hey, I see tea leaves. I don't know how to read them. Can you tell me? Well, I'll tell you that the people that are in the room are not talking out loud, which is a very important adjustment and a reflection of how to deal
Healthy.
tactically with the White House.
Hey, but
It's a good change. Yeah.
okay, it's a good change on one hand, and I understand the tactical necessity of it. But on the other hand, if a Canadian side is staying mum, keeping their head down and doing the work, and the American side has their ambassador out publicly doing interview after interview talking about how Canada screwed the pooch and Mark Carney is terrible and our Canadian negotiators quote unquote suck, then we're dealing with an informational asymmetry.
Yep.
Right? Whereas
Yep.
like we can't actually present our case for our perspective on the things, and we can't or we can't even domestically present our case for how we're approaching this. And the Americans can run circles around us on the comms file.
Well, you're summarizing the issue today on how to get a deal with someone who doesn't need a deal from you, politically or otherwise. They need it economically, but the president is not. He doesn't. My opinion is, doesn't really care about what this does for him politically, and as long as he can, from a comms perspective, talk about some wins, he can alter reality in an electorate that is at least half of which is really happy to just parrot anything he said. I'll use the World Series analogy here. The Blue Jays were not supposed to be competitive with the Dodgers. They would have had to do everything possibly right, and the Dodgers would have had to stumble for us to have been in this. We were all saying, "Oh my God, it's great. We're in a World Series, even if we get swept." Well, we pushed them to a seventh game and we lost by 3 or 4 inches on a slide to home plate. In part because the Blue Jays played very disciplined baseball. Pete Hoekstra, everybody's favorite ambassador to Canada.
He's really
Uh,
has become like a bit of an anti-hero, like a folk hero. Like I
yeah,
fully expect in 20 years we're going to be singing sea shanties about this guy in Newfoundland.
it's really funny because when I first met him, we really mixed it up. I mean, it was not pleasant conversation for anybody who was around it.
Oh,
And
could I have been there for that? That would have been. I'd be quiet. I just watch.
yeah, I bet. Well, look, and he and I have sparred publicly. I mean, I'm not the ambassador of the U.S., but we sparred publicly over the last year or so. But I saw him. I had a meeting with him last week, and then on occasion to talk to him casually. Um, he has moderated his comments on Canada.
Mhm.
There is no annexation talk, which was the prickly opening the first time many of us met him. And he is talking about, if you listen to him as a signal, he's talking about off ramps. Look, we do need aluminum and steel, and we need energy products. And, make the case for how we do cars together. I think it's important because Pete Hoekstra, if he's anything, he's a very good um, communicator of what the boss wants him to say. And
Mm.
the boss wanted him to say last year, 51st state, you guys need us. We don't need you for anything. And you should genuflect. And now he's saying some different things. I want to say it's because he spent a lot of time making some good relationships in Canada. And I do know, in fairness to Pete, is that he's met with a bunch of people in our industry. It's a bunch of those people say, I really like this guy. He's absolutely blunt, but I like him. And he is in turn, I think, seen in, at least in automotive, how terribly integrated we are. You can't really make arguments of like, we're going to crush you. Well, if you crush me, you're going to crush yourself. Um, so I won't call this total detente. I think he's an important player in the space. He does, Jen, to your point, get to run around and do comms that we can't and won't. But we're not supposed to win this game. We should um, stay disciplined and not worry about our pride. Let's worry about it after we see the results. I'll make a prediction here that I think that we're going to have peace on this file. It's going to happen in the fall. And you're going to hear people like Pete Hoekstra start to say really useful things about the Canada-U.S. relationship, because if they do peace in North America, and I think they're negotiating something that is going to affect all of us in Beijing right now for a long
Mhm.
time to come, he's going
Mhm.
to find other places to pick on and or other distractions that he's going to need, um, or he's going to benefit from Canada being on side. Uh,
As
we'll get
always,
our piece.
our greatest leverage in Canada is limited American bandwidth.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Look, nobody wanted this. And I would say nobody includes, at least in automotive, nobody in the US in automotive wanted this. And
Yeah.
so, um, uh, and there's been no benefit. So say, hey, we didn't want this, but hold on, you benefited us. Well, you haven't benefited us. You've cost the hell out of us. So nothing really has changed. And those industries and those American stakeholders are increasingly being less prickly, talking about off ramps and cooperation, certainly wanting us to make concessions in advance because it makes it easier for them to change their position. And this is where it's important to have some discipline. And I'll bring this story all the way, this interview, right back to that Politico story. There are unnamed sources in that story that I know and that I won't out here that have been peddling that Canada is bad, Canada caused for its own rupture. Um, uh, is completely untrue. And 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 I know those people, and I've said to them directly, stay out of it. Don't. This is the highest stakes, uh, most head down game of poker that we've ever had to play here. If you're going to be disruptive, at least have the balls to put your name to that statement. And if you don't, then remember the name on the front of your passport. And and there's a specific person that's going to hear this and say, he's talking about me. And I am. And there's a few of those, and we don't need those this summer.
Couple of points. One is just as a general joke. When the Americans talk about annexation and 51st state thing, all I think in my head is monkey's paw. Be careful what you wished for. Like,
Right.
like there are some Canadian provinces right now that'd be a heck of a time. So anyway, speaking as an
Yeah.
Albertan. Secondly, what you're saying, I think strikes me as having the ring of truth, but it puts journalists like me in a really awkward position. If I'm a Canadian journalist who has spent 10 years covering Canada, and my faith in our institutional capacity, my faith in our ability to function appropriately in the world, and my faith in our ability to get things done domestically is somewhere below a sewer grate. So I hear you saying, like, we have to keep our heads down and just let the Americans skate around us because we're playing a game of high stakes poker. And I kind of have to roll with that. And then on the other hand, I have to balance that against the fact that I don't have a lot of faith in Canadians right now. I don't actually have a
Yeah.
lot of faith that we're that smart or that competent or that capable. And as a journalist, it's not really my job to be an unqualified cheerleader, even for my own team. It's my job to be like, maybe we could be doing better at some things.
Yeah.
So how do I balance those two perspectives without, single-handedly blowing up the country's economy? Which I clearly have the power to do. I mean, it's all in my hands.
Well, I've heard that said about you, Jen. Um, it would be really interesting to be a journalist right now because that doesn't help the trade. When you've got people who aren't talking, it doesn't help the trade. I'll tell you
That's what
what.
I'm saying.
Yeah, I'll tell you that from a business advocate point of view, and someone who, by the way, speaks on the record all the time. Jen, I did 913 on the record interviews last year. I share, because I care, but because I care, I watch what I share. We are the business advocates. I'll say the Prime Minister's Canada-U.S. Relations Council. There's a series of people around the table, and in our last meeting, we shared data points. Look, if you're going to keep your head down and play poker differently, then let's not play poker emotionally. Let's figure out the cards that we have. Let's try to tactically present them at the right time. Let's be serious about where we have our weaknesses. Let's be honest with each other where the Americans can exploit that. And let's remember that the people who play the cards are the people that we nominated as the chief negotiators. I went through 7 rounds and 17 months of the NAFTA negotiations. We were in the room next door. That was the way that we did the industry advocates. You're not at the table, but you're next door. They could press pause and come check with you. That's the way we need to do this. We didn't do that on TPP. We never did this before. We borrowed this, actually, ironically, from the Mexicans. And we're going to do that now. And I think that Canadians, if you don't hear a lot from the Canadian side, especially when, damn, you just want to hit back when someone says something really stupid from the other side, know that what we're doing instead, and we'll see what happens in the results, is that we are drilling down on data and scenario planning and tactics, and then holding the government and its negotiating team accountable to it. Ultimately, the government will be judged on the results that we get. What the government is not missing is intel, insight, and network from industry and other stakeholders. We've challenged them to do the best job they can, and that we've committed to them that they've got access to everything they want to make sure that they understand the positions that they need to take. In some cases, are existential.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by ACDC. Canada's defense industrial base is fragmented. Critical platforms are owned and controlled abroad. That model doesn't work anymore. The Alliance of Canadian Defense Companies is rebuilding Canada's sovereign defense industrial base. ACDC champions Canadian-owned, Canadian-controlled companies that design, build, sustain, and export next-generation defense systems. Change requires new processes, new policies, and new behavior. ACDC membership is open to Canadian-controlled defense companies ready to lead that change. To join, email info@alliancecanada.com.
My concern here is that a scenario where one partner has the ability to control the narrative and the other partner understands that it's tactically important not to control the narrative and to do things quietly, is that is an asymmetric relationship. That is not a partnership, right? And the other concern that I have with that is that in that scenario where the Americans to talk to anybody they want, get anybody quoted they want, get any media they want, and the Canadians can't or won't engage with effective comms, even tactical effective comms, is a situation where the Americans can chip away domestic support for what the current government is doing because the Canadians aren't able to keep up with that. And that's what I kind of see happening. I see the Americans being very effective at using the Conservatives as an opposition wedge in order to underline sort of Canadian overall unity for Canada on the trade file. And I don't see the Canadians being able to effectively play that game back in the current asymmetry.
Well, I would do nothing but agree with you.
Okay.
That
Oh,
is a
well, I mean,
challenge.
we're in
Yeah,
violent agree. I hate it when
yeah,
people are in violent agreement with
yeah.
me.
It's the reality of the moment. When the PM says, Let's try to control the things we can control," we can't control that. And if we go back to um, the reaction to the Doug Ford's ads, which if you look at the storyboard of those ads, I don't know what the issue was, but the
The
reaction,
issue is that the junior partner dared to speak up.
yeah, sure, sure,
The don't we know
sure.
our place was actually the issue there.
Sure, but let's learn from that. And then
Sure.
also remember that, hey, by the way, you're going to run out of aluminum supply if you're not getting it from Canada
Hmm.
um, before the year is out, or you're going to pay the premium that you charged yourself in those 950,000 Ford F-150s, which, when they're profitable, that profit goes to Dearborn,
Hmm.
goes from Dearborn to the IRS. You've got to let the cake bake a little bit here. Look, I'm as punchy as the rest of them. You said, hey, I want to talk to you because you were spicy on Twitter. You should see me in person. And I don't
Okay.
say anything different in person than I say online. And
Why we like each other, I'm telling you.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I've become absolutely, fiercely, everyday, patriotically Canadian. And I'm not sure that that's our default setting as a country. We're a peaceful country. We've got issues that are regional. Sometimes they're national, but we don't, we don't hang our flag on our front porches like large parts of the U.S. does.
Well,
And
and now in Alberta, I can tell you we done it.
yeah, yeah, I bet. And you know what? Like, when you talk about Americans playing a crazy comms game, when Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent go on a Sunday morning shows, political shows, and they say, well, parts of Canada, the energy parts, or, they've got their separatist movements in Alberta. They are absolutely, they know what they're doing when they're stoking the fire on things like that. It would be great to be able to just smack them right back on that. But I think what's important is that they're hoping that, in some cases, hoping that we do, and we take our eye off the fact that we need to get rid of the national security tariffs. And it's going to be difficult. All these issues are difficult. We've had decades-long difficulty with similar issues in Quebec. We have to manage them ourselves internally, long-term. We're not going to see a solution one day, some court ruling that says you can't ask that question in a referendum and have those things go away. But the Americans are picking those scabs, just like the Chinese picked those scabs when they put the canola tariffs on. Just like the Russians picked those scabs when I get ratioed on Twitter by anonymous accounts.
Mhm.
Um, we're never going to be the bigger partner. We're never going to have equal leverage. It's always going to be asymmetric. But in the end, it's the results that matter. And the Blue Jays almost did it. We can't afford to almost do it. So I'll have a drink with Pete Hoekstra again, and try to get to know him a little bit to get a better understanding of what exactly is he signaling. And I think we all should do the same. And we will starve the journalists, that's for sure. But not because people like me don't want to absolutely talk to people like you for 45 minutes.
Well, I'm a delight.
Yeah,
Look, there's one final little anecdote I'll stay in that I know you've got to let you go, and that is if you see a coyote chasing a rabbit, most people put their money on the coyote. Never put
yeah.
your money on the coyote. You put your money on the rabbit, and that's because the coyote runs for his supper and the rabbit runs for his life. And that I think
That is
basically sums up where we're at here.
that's a great way to end that, for sure. We're running for
There
our
you go.
lives. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate your time and love to have you again on again soon.
Thank you, Jen.